They say the Fitzgeralds were the only family whose blood ran clear, as if the quarry itself had chosen them. And when the town vanished, the water stayed restless, as though something beneath it was still trying to breathe. Where the land dipped low and the air forever smelled faintly of wet stone, there stood the town of Marrow's Hollow, Ohio. In 1868, it was little more than a handful of limestone cottages clinging to the rim of a vast quarry, the water below so deep and still that locals said it had no bottom. The quarry fed the town, its stone built the churches, its water filled the wells, and it swallowed what the earth no longer wanted. In that place of gray fog and echoing hammers lived the Fitzgerald family, a name spoken with equal parts respect and superstition. They were Irish by blood, though some said even that word didn't apply. The patriarch, Cormac Fitzgerald, had come to the Hollow a decade earlier with a wife too frail for travel and 3 small children. He was a quiet man, fair and broad-shouldered, who labored from dawn to dusk cutting the very limestone that would one day bear his house. The house stood near the quarry's lip, so close that the windows looked directly over the still surface. People called it foolish, building so near the edge, but Cormac only replied that water had always been kind to him. By the time the town learned to whisper, their veins ran clear, like the quarry's heart, the Fitzgeralds had already begun to seem different. No illness ever seemed to take them fully. No heat made them sweat, no cold made them shiver. When a horse kicked young Agnes Fitzgerald in the leg, and the skin split open, the doctor said she bled, like a thawed icicle. Colorless, thin, not quite right, he wiped his hands and would not meet her mother's eyes afterward. The quarry reflected the Fitzgerald home perfectly at night, so perfectly villagers claimed the reflection lingered even when clouds covered the moon. Some swore they saw shapes moving beneath that mirrored image, long after the lamps in the house had gone dark. The family kept to themselves. They attended church but sat in the last pew, always damp from the quarry's mist. Their clothes smelled faintly of minerals. When they shook hands, their palms were cold as spring water. Children whispered that the Fitzgeralds never slept, that they sat by their windows until dawn, watching the quarry breathe. But perhaps what unsettled the town most was the silence. The Fitzgerald home never echoed with laughter or quarrel, only the steady drip of water from the eaves and the faint sound of something moving beneath the boards, not footsteps exactly, but the soft rhythm of a current. And as the years passed, the townsfolk learned to avert their eyes when walking past that house on the cliff, for fear that the water below might look back. The fever came quietly, like a mist creeping in from the quarry. One morning, little Agnes Fitzgerald failed to rise for chores, her skin glistening with a faint sheen as though dew had settled upon her. Her mother found her trembling beneath her quilt, her lips pale, her breath shallow but steady. It was not the violent sort of sickness that takes a child quickly. It was slower, deliberate, like something watching her from beneath the skin. By midday, the girl began to bleed from the nose. At least, that's what her mother thought, until she wiped at it and found her hand not red, but wet with a colorless liquid that caught the light like glass. It was thin but cold, almost sharp to the touch, and it left her fingers smelling faintly of stone and rain. When her father saw it, he said nothing at all, only went to fetch the doctor, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor, though the earth outside was dry. Dr. Eli Cartwright arrived by evening, his spectacles fogged from the quarry's vapor. He was a man of science, proud of his reason, but as he approached Agnes's bedside, his confidence faltered. The girl's eyes were half open, their irises pale as frost. Her pulse fluttered like a bird beneath thin skin. When he pressed the cloth to her face, the strange fluid welled again, tracing lines down her temples and into her hair. "It's not blood," he muttered, half to himself. "It's some bodily vapor. Perhaps the humors have turned." He collected a vial of it, holding it to the lamplight. It refracted color like the quarry water at noon, blue, green, then perfectly clear again. The room seemed colder for it. "She'll recover," he told Mrs. Fitzgerald, though his voice lacked conviction. "Plenty of rest, boiled water, no Sunday." But when he turned to leave, his hand shook, and the vial trembled with a faint, crystalline sound. Word spread faster than fever. By morning, the neighbors were whispering. Some said the child had taken the quarry's sickness, others that the lake had claimed its own through her veins. A midwife swore she'd seen Agnes drink from the well at night, staring into it as if something below called her name. Children in town began avoiding the Fitzgerald path altogether, crossing to the far side of the road when passing their gate. Agnes's fever broke after 3 days, but she did not return to herself. She sat by the window, her face pale, her reflection in the glass faintly rippling though the pain did not move. When her mother touched her cheek, it was cool, not the cool of convalescence, but of deep water. From that day, the villagers said the Fitzgerald girl was no longer ill. She had merely been time's claimed. Asterisk. The first entries in Dr. Eli Cartwright's ledger were calm, methodical, the handwriting tight and certain. He had always been a man of measure, ink, quill, precision. But when the first Fitzgerald case entered his pages, the lines began to wander, as though his hand could no longer trust what it wrote. The ledger opens with clinical detail, each word crisp and exact. Asterisk. Subject, Agnes Fitzgerald. Fever subsided. Nasal discharge colorless. Specific gravity lower than water. No scent of iron or decay. Asterisk beneath it, a sketch of a vial perfectly clear, the liquid inside drawn as if light itself could not contain it. The next page records her father. Asterisk, laceration to the palm. No visible blood. Upon incision, the wound exudes a substance thin as rain, without stain. Evaporates within moments. Patient reports no pain, only chill. Asterisk, Cartwright's pen presses hard here, the ink darker than before, blotting the paper as though the quill trembled in his grip. He begins to test the substance. In one entry, he notes that the liquid leaves frost upon glass. In another, that it reflects light, even in darkness. The language grows erratic, his medical terms faltering into something like confession. Asterisk. There is no pulse in this fluid, yet it moves. No odor of life, yet it breathes upon the surface as though the water remembers its vessel. Asterisk. The tone shifts by the week. At first, fascination, the thrill of discovery, then confusion, and finally a creeping dread that bleeds through his sentences. The later pages are less journal than warning. Asterisk. Second case, Cormac Fitzgerald, age 42, deep abrasion to forearm from quarry stone. Flow of fluid consistent with daughter's condition, tested with heat, boils at no temperature measurable. Tested with flame, resists entirely. Tested with mercury, absorbs and disappears. Asterisk. The ink stops halfway through the next line. When it resumes, the words have changed. Asterisk. I cannot tell where the pulse ends and the trickling begins. Asterisk. By the final entry, the handwriting has decayed into slanted, uneven lines. He writes of dreams of water pressing against his ears, whispering in a voice he cannot name. Asterisk. The quarry watches them. Asterisk, he notes. Asterisk. The lake feeds them and drinks them both. Their veins are not of blood but of memory. Asterisk. The ledger ends abruptly on a torn page, as if the doctor stopped mid-thought or was pulled from his desk. Those who found it later said the ink on the last words had not dried, though decades had passed. And in the margin, beside his final trembling sentence, he had scrawled a question rather than an observation. Asterisk. If water learns the rhythm of a heart, does it ever forget? Asterisk. They said it happened on a Thursday, the day the fog never lifted from the quarry. The men were blasting near the north wall, their shouts echoing through the stone pit like cannon fire, when someone cried out that Cormac Fitzgerald had slipped. The rope that should have held him taut snapped clean, its fibers slick with morning dew. By the time the others reached the edge, he was gone, swallowed by the quarry's pale reflection without a sound. The water barely rippled, as if it had been waiting for him. They threw ropes, poles, even lanterns that fizzled and sank. The foreman ordered a team to circle down the narrow cut toward the lower ledge, where the quarry face met the water. By then, an hour had passed. Men stripped their shirts, diving into the cold, their voices breaking against the cavern walls. But the water had no bottom that day. It was not muddy or dark, it was clear, disturbingly so, and every diver swore they saw something below them, a shimmer like a breath, exhaled underwater, moving deeper each time they reached for it. When they finally found him, it was by accident. A miner named Grady spotted a figure caught in a tangle of submerged timber, his hair drifting like pale seaweed. They hauled him up with ropes and pulleys, his body limp, face drained of every hint of life. No pulse, no color. Yet as they laid him on the quarry's edge, a faint mist escaped his mouth, one exhale, then another. The foreman swore it wasn't breath but vapor, cool and steady, as though the quarry itself were breathing through him. The doctor came running from the village, his coat unbuttoned, his boots heavy with mud. He knelt, pressed his ear to Cormac's chest, and whispered that the man was gone. But even as he said it, something shifted. Cormac's fingers twitched, his chest rose in shallow rhythm, and when his eyes opened, every man who saw them stepped back. They were not the dull, lifeless eyes of a drowned man. They were clear, too clear, reflecting the quarry and the men themselves within them, like frozen glass. He spoke only once before they carried him home. It was quiet, he said, voice rasping. Quiet and full. Then he closed his mouth, as if afraid the silence might follow him out. For weeks afterward he refused to drink from the well. He fetched his water only from the quarry, lowering his bucket in the dark until it filled, and each time he drank, he held it to the light as though searching for something beneath the surface. The men who pulled him out swore he was never quite the same. They said his breath steamed even in summer, and when he stood too close, his skin seemed to hum faintly, like a stone cooling after heat. At night, when they passed his house by the quarry's edge, they claimed to hear dripping inside, steady and rhythmic, like the sound of the lake learning to breathe. The church was colder than usual that morning, though the sun burned through the glass like polished brass. Father Dunn had prepared everything, the candles trimmed, the silver font gleaming, the holy water drawn fresh from the well before dawn. The Fitzgerald twins had been born only days before, small and silent, their skin pale as unlit wax. Their mother arrived, swaddled in shawls, her face hollow with exhaustion but dry-eyed, her husband guiding her by the arm. Behind them trailed only the midwife and two neighbors, as if the rest of the town had quietly agreed to stay away. The priest remembered the sound of their steps, soft, damp, as though they had crossed a river to reach him. He had baptized every child born in Marrow's Hollow for 20 years, and none had unnerved him. But when he looked upon the Fitzgerald infants, something ancient in him recoiled. They were still, unnaturally so, their eyelids faintly translucent. When he lifted one of them, Maeve, he thought the child did not stir, only blinked once, slow and deliberate, as though marking his face. He began the rite in a whisper, more out of instinct than reverence. In the name of the Father. The air seemed to still around him. When he dipped his fingers into the font, he felt the chill bite to his bones, a cold that belonged not to the well, but to the quarry beyond the fields. He traced the sign of the cross upon the infant's forehead, waiting for the water to roll down her skin as it always did, but it didn't. It vanished, gone before it could drip, as if drawn inward. The child's skin shimmered for a breath, then dulled again to its ghostly hue. He froze, murmuring a prayer under his breath, then turned to the boy, Silas, the same. The water disappeared before it could glisten, swallowed whole, leaving his fingers dry. The twins did not cry, did not flinch, only stared up at him with eyes that caught the candlelight and held it, unblinking. Behind him, the mother whispered something he could not catch, and Cormac tightened his hand around her wrist. The silence in the chapel grew unbearable. The priest faltered, his voice cracking as he tried to finish the blessing. His words came out wrong, broken, unfinished. He dipped his hand again and muttered, the water takes itself, before realizing he had spoken aloud. The midwife gasped. Afterward, he poured what remained of the holy water into the font, and watched as ripples formed though he had not moved. The twins were carried out in silence, their mother looking neither left nor right. For days after, the priest avoided the church at dusk. He said the font would sweat clear droplets at night, as if weeping, though no one had touched it. And when he dreamt, he saw the twins floating weightless in a great dark basin, eyes open, their skin shining where the water had gone in. The summer of 1868 burned through Ohio like a fever that would not break. Crops withered in their furrows, leaves curled to dust, and the air hung thick with the smell of parched earth. Wells that had lasted generations gave up one by one, their ropes lowering into silence. Cattle bellowed at empty troughs, and men dug by lantern light, desperate to strike moisture beneath the cracked clay. By July, even the river that wound through Marrow's hollow had shrunk to a ribbon of mud, but on the edge of town, at the Fitzgerald place by the quarry, the well never ran dry. People noticed first in whispers. A farmhand returning from the ridge claimed he'd seen steam rise from their bucket at dawn, though the air was already hot. He said Cormac Fitzgerald carried it as if it weighed nothing, his sleeve dripping, leaving dark spots on the dirt that never dried. When he told it at the tavern, no one laughed. Within a week, every family in the hollow was watching the Fitzgerald house from their windows. By late July, the drought had grown biblical. Dust clung to throats, the sky refused to break, and the church bell rang only for burials. The town gathered at the square, parched and hollow-eyed, to discuss what should be done. Some proposed rationing what water remained. Others whispered that the Fitzgeralds must be hoarding, that their well was fed by the same unnatural spring that took Cormac's breath and returned it changed. When the priest asked Cormac to share his water with the dying, he only said, "It is not mine to give." That night, several men crept toward the Fitzgerald well with buckets and lanterns. The air grew cooler as they neared, though the wind had long since died. They swore the ground beneath their feet dampened, and a faint mist hung over the stones. When one man lowered a rope, the bucket struck water immediately. But when he drew it up, the liquid within shimmered like glass, cold enough to burn. He touched it and screamed, the skin of his fingers blistered white as frost. The others dropped their buckets and fled. By morning, the tale had spread faster than thirst. The Fitzgerald well, they said, ran not from the earth but from the family itself. Some claimed to see the water glow faintly at night, pulsing like a heartbeat. Others swore that when the wind blew across the quarry, it carried the sound of trickling beneath the ground, as though the very soil beneath their house were alive. Even in winter, when the frost turned barns to tombs, the Fitzgerald well steamed gently in the cold. Villagers avoided its path then, crossing themselves when they passed. They said no drought could touch what did not come from above or below, but from times within. And when the thaw finally came, bringing rain enough to drown the fields, the Fitzgerald well overflowed clear as glass, running downhill in thin, silvery rivulets that vanished before they reached the road. By autumn, the drought broke with a vengeance. Rain came in sheets, filling the quarry until its surface rose higher than any man remembered. The townsfolk welcomed it at first, lifting their faces to the sky like flowers revived. But when the flood settled and the quarry grew still again, they began to notice something different in its reflection. It no longer mirrored the world above as it should have. The sky's color shifted when seen in its depths. Faces lingered longer than their owners. And sometimes, even when no one stood near, something human watched from below. The quarry had always been a place of work, not wonder. Men cut stone by day and left before dusk. But that autumn, few dared to approach it at all. Those who did came away pale and trembling. They said that when the wind stilled and the surface lay flat as glass, the water held more than a reflection, it showed what wasn't there. A child's face beside a man's shoulder. A woman's hands reaching from the shimmer to touch her own image. One miner swore he saw his dead brother smiling faintly in the ripples, as though beckoning him closer. Children, too young to understand fear, turned the quarry into a game. They would gather at the rim at dusk, when the light grew dim and the air smelled faintly of metal, and dare one another to call the Fitzgeralds' names. Maeve Fitzgerald, they'd whisper. Silas Fitzgerald. Sometimes they added the fathers too, shouting into the twilight until their voices echoed like stone cracking in frost. And each time, after a moment of silence, the water would stir not from breeze or pebble, but from within. Ripples would spread outward in perfect circles, one after another, too precise for accident, too steady for wind. The children would scream and scatter, but some swore they heard laughter following them up the hill. Adults dismissed it at first as childish fancy until they saw it themselves. One evening, Father Dunn passed the quarry and glimpsed what he thought was his own reflection bending to drink. But as he stopped, the image did not. It lingered a heartbeat longer, then opened its eyes beneath the surface. He ran all the way to the rectory, leaving his rosary at the water's edge. Before long, the villagers stopped looking directly into the quarry. Even passing at midday, they averted their eyes. The water seemed too alive, too knowing, as if it had learned to mimic not just their faces but their thoughts. Some said the Fitzgeralds were still there, their bodies dissolved but their images caught forever in the quarry's mirror, waiting for someone to look too long and be pulled inside. On quiet nights, when the moon rose pale and the quarry shone like glass, people shut their shutters tight. They said if you stared long enough, the water began to breathe. Martha Coates had delivered near every child in Marrow's Hollow for 30 years. She'd seen births that broke women and births that mended them, and she believed there was little left in the world that could shake her. But the night she was summoned to the Fitzgerald house by the quarry, she later said the air itself seemed to hesitate. The letter had come by hand, folded neatly, written in the careful ink of a man trying to steady his own fear. Asterisk. It is time. Asterisk Cormac had written. Asterisk. Please come quickly. The others cannot help her. Asterisk. When Martha arrived, the lamps inside were already lit, though the hour was late. The house smelled of damp stone and cold water, not sweat or blood as she expected. Mrs. Fitzgerald lay on the bed, her face as white as the linen beneath her. She was silent, her breath slow and even, as if sleep had simply deepened into something stranger. There were no cries, no moans, no tremors of pain. Only the steady trickle of water from somewhere unseen, the sound, Martha thought, of a faucet left open underground. The labor was unlike any she had witnessed. The mother did not strain or scream. She only turned her face toward the ceiling, her eyes half closed. As the child came, her skin grew pale, not with exhaustion but with a clarity that frightened Martha. It thinned before her eyes, as though turning translucent, revealing faint blue veins that glimmered faintly, pulsing not with blood but with light. The air grew cool around her, and the flame in the oil lamp wavered without wind. When the child slipped free, there was no rush of color, no cry to mark its arrival. It lay still for a moment, slick and silent, the umbilical cord pale as silver thread. Martha leaned close, fearing the worst, but then the newborn's eyelids fluttered. It blinked once, just once, and in that instant, she swore its eyes filled the room. They weren't the color of any human child's. They caught the lamplight and held it, bright as the quarry under moon. For a moment, the light seemed to pulse, and Martha's hands went numb. The mother reached out, her fingers trembling. "He's warm," she whispered, her voice distant, almost reverent. Martha didn't answer. She was staring at the child's chest, where the faintest shimmer moved beneath the skin, like ripples in shallow water. The baby drew its first breath, not with a gasp, but with a soft sound, a sigh that felt like the exhale of the lake itself. When Martha told her story later, her voice quivered for the first time in her life. "I saw the child blink before it took its breath," she said. "But those eyes, they were full of light, and for a moment, I think it saw me not as I am, but as I would be beneath the water. After that night, she refused to step near the quarry again. She claimed that whenever she passed by the churchyard, she could hear an infant cooing faintly beneath the earth, a sound like bubbles rising from the deep. It began with murmurs that no one wanted to believe. The Fitzgerald well had always been peculiar, its water too clear, too cold, too deep, but by the spring following the last child's birth, it became something else entirely. The neighbors nearest the quarry were the first to hear it. A woman fetching laundry one evening swore she caught the sound of voices rising from the Fitzgerald yard, though the house itself was dark. Not shouting or prayer, but conversation, the calm cadence of a family speaking low so as not to wake a child. When she drew closer, she realized the sound was not coming from the windows, but from the well itself, a faint echo as though the Fitzgeralds were talking to someone below. Others dismissed her as nervous from the long winter, until the same sounds came again and again. A farmer passing by at dusk claimed he heard two tones, one a man's voice, the other lighter, a woman's, their words indistinct but rhythmically steady, answering and pausing, as if a question were being asked and answered from beneath the earth. Soon after, children dared each other to listen. They would creep near the well and lean over the stones, holding their breath, their faces dim in the lamplight. Some came away laughing, claiming to hear nothing but wind. Others ran home in tears, insisting they'd heard whispers asking their names. One man, Thomas Vale, brought a lantern and decided to see for himself. He said that as he peered into the shaft, he saw his own reflection wavering on the surface of the water, but behind it, faint and clear, another face appeared. It was pale, with eyes like glass and lips moving slowly, as if repeating his own words out of time. He dropped the bucket in panic, and when he pulled it up, the water inside shimmered unnaturally, mirroring not his lantern light, but the window of the Fitzgerald house behind him. He swore he could see figures moving inside, though the home had been dark for hours. By the end of that month, no one drew from the Fitzgerald well. They said it had begun to breathe at night, exhaling a cold mist that drifted across the yard. Those who lived close claimed it hummed softly just before dawn, a low vibration that passed through the ground and settled in their bones. Father Dunn came once, carrying a crucifix and a jug of blessed water, but he never made it past the gate. The moment he heard the voices 2, 3, maybe more, his courage faltered. He left without a word, his lips moving soundlessly in prayer. After that, the Fitzgeralds were seldom seen outside. Yet lamps still burned faintly in their windows, and neighbors swore that if you listened closely enough, you could hear laughter drifting up from the well, thin and distant, like water remembering how to speak. Some nights, the wind carried those sounds farther than it should have down the slope, across the quarry, until it seemed the whole town was whispering back. It was Father Dunn who insisted upon witnesses. By then, the stories had spread too far the well that whispered, the mother's translucent skin, the child who blinked before breath. The priest said the town would go mad if they did not anchor the truth in proof. So, under the dim light of Dr. Cartwright's study, 4 men gathered to see what faith and medicine could not reconcile. The doctor agreed reluctantly, though the lines beneath his eyes showed he had not slept in days. Cormac Fitzgerald sat quietly in the wooden chair by the fire, his hands folded on his knees, his face unreadable. He did not ask why. He only said, "Be careful with what you draw." The doctor prepared the syringe with deliberate calm, the way one might approach a dying fire. The others stood back, Father Dunn, the blacksmith Vale, and Martha Coates, the midwife, who refused to let the men bear witness alone. The air in the room felt heavier than it should, as though the walls leaned closer to listen. Cartwright's hand trembled slightly as he tied the cord around Cormac's arm. The skin there was pale, almost luminous, and the vein beneath it pulsed faintly, but with a rhythm slower than any human heartbeat. When the needle pierced flesh, no one breathed. A moment passed, then another, and instead of the deep red surge of blood, a thin, colorless stream rose into the glass cylinder. It filled slowly, moving like molten glass rather than fluid, refracting light in hues that did not belong to the candle's flame blue, violet, green, then clear again. When the doctor withdrew the needle, there was no wound, no drop left behind, only the faint smell of rain on stone. The witnesses leaned in. Cartwright held the syringe up to the candlelight, his voice low. "Do you see? It lives in the light." The liquid within shimmered, bending the glow into 1,000 tiny spectrums that danced across the ceiling. It was beautiful and wrong. Father Dunn crossed himself. Vale muttered something about witchcraft, his boots scraping backward on the floorboards. Martha only stared. Within moments, the contents of the syringe began to thin, losing substance as if dissolving into the air. The doctor reached to seal it, but the glass turned fogged beneath his fingers. A hiss, soft and quick, and the fluid was gone evaporated, leaving no trace. Only a faint residue of frost lingered along the glass, fading even as they watched. Cormac looked up at them all then, his expression calm, even pitying. "It doesn't stay long outside of us," he said quietly. "It goes back where it belongs." He stood, his skin pale against the lamplight, and for a moment, the flame bent toward him, drawn like breath to a lung. No one spoke after that. The doctor placed the empty syringe on the table and could not bring himself to touch it again. Later, when he wrote the account in his ledger, his ink smudged where his hand shook. His final note for that evening was only one line. Asterisk light cannot bleed, and yet it does. Asterisk. It was the first thaw of spring when Silas Fitzgerald collapsed in the schoolhouse. The children had been restless that morning, the air still heavy with the dampness of melting frost. Miss Eliza Penwell, the teacher, had been reading from the Psalms, her voice thin but steady, when Silas suddenly stiffened in his seat. He had been an odd child, quiet and pale, with eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. The other children said he never ate at recess, only drank from a tin flask he carried everywhere, filled from his family's well. That morning, he had been tracing something into the grain of his desk, a pattern of circles that shimmered faintly when the sunlight touched them when he went still, as though the sound of the words had struck him. At first, the teacher thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he slumped forward, his head striking the wood with a dull, hollow crack. The sound silenced the room. His classmates stared, wide-eyed, waiting for him to groan or stir, but he didn't. Miss Penwell rushed to him, calling his name. There was no response, only the soft gleam of moisture spreading across the desk where his temple had struck. It wasn't blood. There was no color at all, just a thin dew that caught the light, like crystal. When she touched it, it was cold, so cold she snatched her hand back. The children began to murmur. One of them, a boy named Everett, whispered that Silas was cracking open. Another claimed to see mist rise from the boy's hair. Miss Penwell ordered them outside, her voice trembling, but before they obeyed, Silas's body gave a small, jerking shudder. His eyes opened, clear and glassy, and his lips parted as if to speak. Instead, a single bead of water rolled from the corner of his mouth and fell to the floor with a sound like a drop striking stone. That was when the teacher fainted. By the time the older students fetched help, Silas was upright again, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. He did not answer the questions shouted at him, nor did he blink when his father arrived to take him home. The wet mark on the desk had dried, leaving a faint white residue that gleamed under candlelight no matter how often it was scrubbed. For weeks afterward, the children told stories of what they'd seen. Some said he had frozen solid and then thawed before their eyes. Others swore that when he fell, they heard the sound of water moving inside him, like a river beneath ice. They began calling him the glass boy, and none dared sit in his seat again. Miss Penwell never returned to teaching. She spent her days behind closed curtains, whispering to visitors that the child's head hadn't bled but had wept water, and that when she fainted, she dreamed she saw her own reflection bending over him, not above the floor, but beneath it, rippling up at her from a depth that had no bottom. The letter was found years later, folded into the back of an old hymnal that had belonged to Father Dunn. The ink had bled at the edges, as though dampness had seeped into the paper long after his death. It was addressed not to a bishop or superior, but to no one at all, a confession meant for whoever might read it after he was gone. The writing began steady, neat, the hand of a man trained to keep order in his words, but it grew less sure as the pages turned, as though something unseen pressed against his faith. He began by recounting a matter that had troubled him since the spring before, the Fitzgeralds' refusal of communion. He wrote that Cormac and his family continued to attend Mass faithfully, always on time, always seated in the back pew beneath the shadow of the choir loft. They bowed their heads during prayer and crossed themselves with solemn precision, yet when he approached with the chalice, they turned away. At first, he thought it was humility. The Irish were proud of their reverence, especially those who carried guilt from the old country. But as the weeks passed, the refusal persisted. Finally, he asked them why. It was Cormac who answered. "Father," he had said, his voice calm but hollow, "the wine burns." Dunn pressed, thinking he meant the bitterness of strong sacramental drink, but Cormac shook his head. "Not here," he said, touching his throat. "Inside, it burns as if it does not belong." His wife avoided the priest's gaze, her hands folded tight. The children sat silent, pale and still, their eyes fixed on the floor. Dunn recorded that moment in his letter with a trembling line of ink. Asterisk, "I have seen sinners tremble before the blood of Christ, but never one who claimed it burned them." Asterisk. Days later, Cormac came to him privately. He stood in the rectory doorway long after vespers, his hat in his hands, his clothes damp with quarry mist. He did not sit, did not cross himself, only asked in a voice barely more than a whisper, "Can a baptism be undone?" Dunn, startled, told him no, that baptism was eternal, an indelible mark upon the soul. Cormac stared at the floor for a long time before speaking again. "Then what happens," he said, "if the water does not bless but takes?" The priest's letter grew frantic after that. He wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing faint dripping in the chapel though the roof did not leak. He spoke of dreams where the font overflowed with clear water that steamed and hissed when touched. He feared the holy water did not bless them. The letter ended, it claimed them. "And if that is true, then I have made an altar of the quarry itself." After that final line, the page was smeared, the ink washed to gray, as though the paper had wept through his hands. The quarry had been still for months, so still that the surface sometimes froze overnight, trapping a skin of ice so clear it reflected the moon like polished glass. Even the miners, superstitious as they were, had grown used to its silence. They avoided speaking of what had happened to the Fitzgeralds, or the strange brightness that sometimes pulsed deep below when the fog settled, but one evening in late June, the stillness broke. The first to notice was a boy sent to fetch his father's tools from the lower path. He came running into town, wild-eyed, claiming the quarry was breathing. At first, no one believed him. But by nightfall, the sound reached the village, a low, throbbing rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. When the men went to see for themselves, lanterns swaying, they found the water moving, though no wind stirred. It rolled in perfect concentric circles from the center outward, each ring folding over the next, steady as a heartbeat. By dawn, the churning had grown violent. Great bubbles broke the surface, releasing bursts of mist that carried the smell of iron and salt. The quarry walls trembled softly, shedding fragments of stone that fell and vanished into the swirl. The foreman, who had mined there 30 years, swore he felt the ground shift beneath his boots. He ordered everyone back, muttering that the water was coming alive. As the sun climbed, the surface grew lighter not from reflection, but from something shining beneath. The miners stood along the ridge, watching as faint forms drifted up through the turbulence. At first, they thought them tricks of light, air pockets, or debris. Then one of the men, old Isaac Holloway, gasped, and crossed himself. "They're not fish," he said. "They're folk." The others saw it, two silhouettes, faint and pale, moving slowly upward through the depths, not swimming, but rising. The shapes were human or close enough. They turned as if weightless, arms drifting, hair waving like weeds. No faces could be seen, only outlines, but each shimmered faintly as they neared the surface. The men shouted, through stones, but the water only roiled harder, pushing up waves that slapped against the quarry's lip and spilled over the edge. When the first shape broke through, it wasn't a body but a ripple of light that spread like breath, bending the lantern flames toward the water. The men fled, leaving their tools behind, claiming they heard voices in the mist, faint and layered, like a family murmuring through walls. By morning, the quarry was still again, the surface smooth as glass, yet the color had changed. It no longer reflected the sky but carried its own hue, a cold, luminous blue, as if the water now remembered what had risen through it. Those who dared return said the air above it hummed softly like a held note, waiting for something to answer. Maeve Fitzgerald's death came without warning. One morning, she was seen walking along the edge of the quarry, her hair unbound, the mist curling around her like smoke. By evening, she was gone. Her mother said she had gone to bed early, complaining of dizziness. When they went to wake her, she was lying still, eyes open, her skin pale as moonlight, her lips faintly parted as if she had been about to speak. The family said there had been no pain, no fever, no sound, only silence, as if the breath had simply slipped from her without struggle. Dr. Eli Cartwright was summoned the next morning. He came reluctantly, already haunted by what he had seen in the Fitzgeralds before. When he entered the house, the air smelled faintly of damp stone and iron. Maeve lay on the dining table, her hands crossed over her chest, her face so calm she might have been asleep. But when the doctor touched her wrist, her skin was cool, cooler than death, almost soothing, as though whatever had left her had taken warmth with it. The family stood aside as he worked, their faces blank, their eyes distant. He tried at first to perform his duty by the book, though every instinct in him recoiled. When he made the first incision along her sternum, he expected the rush of dark blood, the usual violence of anatomy. But none came. Instead, a clear, glimmering liquid welled up, thick but translucent, catching the lamplight like glass. It rolled down her sides in perfect beads, leaving no stain on the cloth. Cartwright leaned closer, his hand trembling as he collected some in a vial. It was cool to the touch, and faintly alive he could feel it move, pulsing, as though it responded to his warmth. Beneath the ribs, the organs were suspended in that same fluid, preserved, unblemished. He wrote later in his ledger that the heart appeared to float, its chambers filled not with blood, but with that same shimmering substance. Asterisk. It moved of its own accord. Asterisk, he recorded. Asterisk, like breath trapped in water. Asterisk. The others in the room crossed themselves, unable to watch. Cormac stood nearest, silent, his face unreadable. When Cartwright turned to him, asking for permission to continue, Cormac only said, "You've seen enough." The words held neither anger nor grief, only resignation. That night, the doctor sealed the vial, but by morning it was empty. The liquid had vanished, leaving only a faint ring of frost around the glass. He burned his notes the same day, keeping only one line in his journal. Asterisk. She was not drained of life, she was emptied of something purer. Whatever lived in her was never meant for air. Asterisk. Within the week, Cartwright shuttered his practice. He refused patients, refused to speak, and when asked why, he simply said, "There are bodies that do not belong to earth. I have touched one, and I will not touch another." From that day forward, he never went near the quarry again, claiming the sound of it breathing kept him awake at night. The storm came without warning, a black wall of rain rolling in from the west. The wind howled through Marrow's hollow like something alive, bending trees and tearing shingles loose. By dusk, the quarry had begun to rise. its surface swallowing the ledges one by one until it reached the lip where the Fitzgerald property stood. Neighbors watched from the higher ridge as lightning forked over the water, striking so close that the air itself seemed to split. They said the Fitzgerald house was lost in a curtain of rain, its lamps flickering like eyes beneath the storm. By midnight, the quarry had overflowed. Water poured over its rim, carving channels through the soil and swallowing fences. The path to the Fitzgeralds' front door became a river, and the sound of the flood drowned every other noise. People in town shouted prayers against their windows, believing no structure near the pit could survive the night. When morning came, they went to see what the storm had left. The quarry had stilled again, swollen and dark, its edges slick with mud. Trees had been uprooted, tools washed into the fields, livestock drowned in their pens. But at the center of the devastation stood the Fitzgerald house, untouched. The mud line on the walls showed that water had reached halfway up the windows, yet the panes were spotless. The door hung firm on its hinges, and when the villagers pushed it open, a wave of dry air met them. The floorboards gleamed, unwarped. No puddles, no dampness. Even the hearth was clean, its ashes undisturbed. The family sat at the table as if nothing had happened, their clothes neat, their hair dry. Cormac looked up when the first neighbor stepped inside and said only, "The storm has passed." Some fell to their knees, calling it a miracle. They said the Lord had spared the righteous, that the Fitzgeralds had been washed clean by faith. But Dr. Cartwright, who arrived an hour later, said nothing of God. He walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the untouched floor. When he stepped back outside, his boots sank into mud, and he turned to the others with eyes hollow from too much knowing. "It's not protection," he said. "It's refusal." The word unsettled them. He explained no further, but those who followed his gaze toward the quarry saw what he meant. The water there was higher than ever, pressing against the stone like something alive. It did not lap or ripple, but held perfectly still, as though the storm had poured itself into it and been absorbed. Some said the Fitzgeralds had made a pact with the quarry, that the flood had come to claim them and found no room left inside. Others whispered that the water had recognized its own and would not rise against them. That night, the rain began again, softer now, a steady whisper against the roofs. In every home across Marrow's hollow, the floors creaked and the walls moaned with moisture, but in the Fitzgerald house, the silence was absolute. The storm could not touch it. Inside, they said, the air was still and cold, as though the house no longer belonged to weather at all. The storm that night was unlike any the village had seen. It began as a fine mist, rising from the quarry rather than falling from the sky, curling through the fields and over the stone fences like breath. The air held a strange chill, sharp and brittle, and by midnight, the mist thickened into a steady fall. At first, it seemed to be rain, gentle, constant, a welcome relief after weeks of oppressive calm. But when the villagers stepped outside, they heard it before they felt it, a faint tinkling sound, like wind chimes swaying in the distance. What struck the roofs and windows was not water. By morning the streets glittered. Every surface fence post, lantern, leaf, was coated in a sheen of tiny translucent droplets, each one shaped like a tear, clear and perfectly smooth. They shimmered under the pale light, catching the dawn in hues that had no name. The children, always the first to forget fear, ran out to gather them by the handful, laughing as they slipped through their fingers. But the laughter stopped when one of them pressed a droplet to his ear and whispered that he could hear it humming. The sound was faint, no louder than the buzz of a fly trapped in glass. But when more of the villagers tried it, they heard it too, a low, steady vibration that grew stronger the longer one listened. It wasn't a tone made by wind or weather. It was closer to a breath, a pulse, something alive beneath the surface. They found the largest clusters not in the streets or fields but on the hill overlooking the quarry, where the Fitzgeralds' plot had been marked years before, but never filled with graves. The droplets there were thicker, piled in small drifts like snow, though the air was warm enough to melt ice. None melted. When the priest arrived, he knelt and gathered a few in his hands, then dropped them almost immediately. His palms bore fine cuts where the shards had kissed his skin, but no blood welled up, only a faint sting, followed by a cold that seemed to seep inward. The doctor came later and took several into his vials. He held one to the light and found that when the flame reflected inside it, something faint moved, a ripple, almost a figure. He closed the vial quickly and said nothing. That night, the shards began to dissolve into the soil. The villagers watched as the ground drank them in, leaving faint trails of light that faded as they sank. Some said the humming continued long after, a resonance in the air that could be felt but not heard. In the days that followed, nothing remained of the glass rain except the faint shimmer around the Fitzgerald plots, as if the earth itself had turned translucent. The people stopped walking near that hill. They said the rain had not fallen from the sky, it had risen from below, and the ground was only taking back what belonged to it. By the time spring settled over Marrow's Hollow, the Fitzgerald house had gone silent. No chimney smoke, no lamps in the windows, no sound of movement beyond the thin walls. The neighbors were the first to notice the absence. The family had always kept to themselves, but they were predictable, the faint rhythm of a door at dawn, the glow of light against the fog at dusk. Now, even those small signs were gone. The church bell had tolled for Easter, and still no Fitzgeralds were seen in the pews. It was Martha Coates, the old midwife, who finally went to check. She told later how the air grew colder as she neared the property, though the sun was warm behind her. The ground was soft with thaw, but no mud clung to her shoes. When she reached the gate, it stood half open, creaking gently in the breeze. The house beyond looked almost beautiful in its stillness, the windows gleaming clear as mirrors, the white of the walls unblemished. She knocked once, twice, then pushed the door open. It gave easily, swinging wide with a sigh. Inside, everything was in place. Chairs neatly aligned, plates on the table, clean and dry, the hearth empty but swept. Even the beds were made, as though the family had stepped out only moments before. But there was something strange in the air, not rot, not the stale scent of an empty house, but the faint smell of wet stone, like the quarry after rain. She called their names Cormac, Maeve, Silas, and each time her voice echoed faintly, as if the rooms themselves were answering from far away. When the others arrived, drawn by her trembling, they searched every corner. The cellar was dry, the wardrobes untouched, the linens folded. There was no sign of flight or struggle. Only near the back door did they find something out of place. A series of wet footprints on the wooden floor. They began small, almost delicate, as if from bare feet, then grew larger, heavier, leading toward the threshold. The prints glistened faintly, not with water but something clearer, catching the light like glass. They followed the trail down the slope toward the quarry. The path was slick, though no rain had fallen, the air colder with each step. The prints continued to the very edge, then stopped. The last mark was half over the rim, toes pointed downward, as though the final step had not been taken but absorbed. The quarry below was still, reflecting nothing. When they looked back toward the house, they said the windows no longer reflected the sky. Instead, they showed the onlookers' faces distorted, pale and hollow-eyed, as though seen through deep water. That night, no one in Marrow's Hollow lit a lamp. By morning, mist rose from the quarry again, spreading through the fields like breath. It left behind a trail of dew that shimmered faintly before vanishing, and with it, the last trace of the Fitzgeralds. The Harrows were the first to move into the hollow after the Fitzgeralds vanished. They came from the next county over, drawn by the cheap land and the quiet promise of rebuilding a life far from the noise of the railroads. The house by the quarry had stood empty for almost a year, its white paint dulled to ash, the windows blank as eyes. When the family arrived, Richard Harrow, his wife Lillian, and their two young sons, they found it strangely well preserved. Not a single board had warped, no dust on the sills. It was as though the place had been waiting. For a time, things seemed ordinary. They scrubbed the floors, aired the rooms, mended the shutters. The boys played along the fence that bordered the quarry path, tossing stones toward the water below. Yet it didn't take long for the unease to begin. The livestock were the first to sense it. The Harrows had brought 3 cows and a pair of horses. When they led them to the old well, the animals balked, hooves digging deep into the soil. The cows lowed in distress, the horses snorted and pulled their reins, their eyes rolling white. Lillian thought it was the smell stale water after years of neglect, but when she drew a bucket herself, what came up was clear and shining, almost luminous. The surface rippled, though her hands were steady. That night, Richard poured some into a trough, hoping thirst would override fear. None of the animals touched it. By morning, the water had gone still again, the surface smooth and glassy. When he stirred it with a stick, it moved oddly, not like water disturbed, but as if something just beneath the surface had shifted, reacting to the intrusion. He said nothing to his wife, though she had already begun to notice that the air around the well was always cool, the ground damp even in Sunday. A week later, Lillian woke in the middle of the night to a sound she could not place. It was faint at first, a soft murmur like wind slipping through a hollow. Then she realized it was laughter, children's laughter, muffled and bubbling, as though echoing up through a chamber of stone. She rose and went to the window, heart pounding. Outside, the well glimmered faintly under the moon, small ripples blooming across its surface, though the trees stood still. She called her sons' names, thinking one of them had wandered out, but both lay asleep, their faces serene, their breath shallow as if dreaming of water. By morning the sound was gone, but the air in the house felt heavier, saturated. The boys began speaking of shapes they saw in the bucket when drawing water faces smiling faintly, hands reaching just beneath the reflection. Lillian forbade them to go near it again. But at night the laughter returned, threading through the walls like running water. She would lie awake listening, and sometimes, when the moonlight hit the well just right, it seemed to pulse with a rhythm too steady to be wind. A rhythm that felt almost like breathing. When Dr. Eli Cartwright returned to Marrow's Hollow, the town was little more than a name whispered by travelers who passed it at a distance. The roads were half swallowed by grass, the fences sagged, and the quarry lay hidden beneath a permanent veil of mist. He came in early autumn, his hair gone white, his gait unsteady, clutching a leather satchel whose straps had long since cracked. To the few who saw him on the road, he looked less like a physician returning home than a man walking back into a fever dream. No one recognized him at first. Most who had known the Fitzgeralds were long dead or gone. Only the ruins of their name lingered on a fading ledger in the church, on the lips of those who muttered prayers at crossroads. Cartwright asked no one for directions. He seemed to remember the way on his own, moving with a grim certainty toward the house that stood by the quarry's edge. It was nearly dark when he arrived. The house was half collapsed now, its roof bowed like a spine, the well still standing a few paces from the porch. The stones around it were damp, though the air was dry. He set down his satchel, drew out a single vial, and lowered it into the water with trembling hands. The rope creaked, the glass clinked faintly, and when he drew it up, the vial was filled with a liquid so clear it seemed empty. Yet when he held it to his lantern, the light fractured into shifting hues, no color at all, yet somehow, all of them. He whispered to himself as he had decades ago, his voice brittle, still alive. He took notes by candlelight, his writing cramped and unsteady. The water did not still. Even in the glass it moved, curling against the edges as if it breathed. When he placed his fingertip against the vial, condensation bloomed on the inside, shaped faintly like a pulse. He wrote that it refracted light exactly as the Fitzgerald blood once had, scattering the flame into a pale spectrum that shimmered red only for a moment before vanishing again. His final entry was written in a shaking hand, the ink spattered and uneven. Asterisk, the Fitzgeralds never left. Asterisk, he wrote. Asterisk, they only changed states. Their blood has learned stillness, their breath has found water. Asterisk. The next morning, his horse was found tethered by the road, reins trailing in the mud. The satchel lay open nearby, its contents soaked though no rain had fallen. The vial was missing. Those who dared look into the well after swore the water inside had grown brighter, as though it remembered being touched. And on still nights that followed, when the moonlight struck the surface, it rippled once not with wind, but with recognition. The camera opens on silence. Only the low hum of crickets and the slow lap of unseen water fill the air. The screen glows with a dim blue haze, the outline of the old quarry emerging from the dark like a scar across the land. The modern narrator's voice cuts softly through the stillness, calm, measured, the tone of someone who has come not to explain, but to bear witness. The quarry lies fenced now, its perimeter sealed by rusting wire and leaning signs that read Time's private property, no entry asterisk. Beyond them, the water gleams black under a thin mist, reflecting nothing but its own depth. The town around it is gone, reduced to a scatter of foundations and weathered stones hidden by weeds. Only the air remembers what happened here, and even that, the narrator says, feels heavy, as if it too is reluctant to speak. Archival images flicker between shots. The Fitzgerald house before its collapse, the doctor's ruined ledger, the priest's trembling letter. Each page turns beneath the steady rhythm of the voice. The story, once whispered in fear, is now being told as history, but even history cannot strip it of unease. Locals still refuse to go near the site after dusk. One man, interviewed briefly, claims the fog never touches the trees, only the water, like it knows where it belongs. Another swears he's seen faces forming on the surface, pale and fleeting, as if pressed against glass from beneath. The footage shows only ripples, faint and circular, breathing outward from the center. The narrator walks the fence line as dawn begins to break. Their reflection wavers on the water's edge, fractured by the mist. They speak of what science might call mineral vapors, of groundwater reflecting light in strange ways, of legends born from isolation and grief. Yet, even as they speak, their breath catches. A shape moves beneath the fog, not a wave, not wind, a slow, deliberate ripple that circles once, then fades. The camera trembles slightly. They stop walking. Their voice lowers to a whisper, the closing words of the documentary written as if not to be spoken aloud, but to be left behind. It's been more than a century since the Fitzgeralds disappeared. The quarry has swallowed storms, floods, and names, but the water never settled. On warm nights, it still fogs, as though breathing. And if you stand close enough, you might see them faint faces forming where the mist is thickest. The lens lingers one final moment on the stillness, the water black, unmoving, the world around it soundless. Then the narrator's voice returns, the faintest tremor threading through calm. If you ever draw from an old well, and the water looks too clear, don't drink. The Fitzgeralds are still in there waiting to be remembered. The screen fades to black, leaving only the echo of dripping water, steady as a heartbeat.